The rain fell like judgment from the sky, cold and heavy as iron nails. Eleanor stood alone on the porch of the half-built church, her wedding dress soaked through the lace clinging to her skin, like vines refusing to let go. Her veil had been torn in the wind, her bouquet flung into the mud when the townsfolk started laughing. They weren't kind laughs. They were the cruel kind, the sort that echoes and stains. She had been left at the altar. The groom, a boy barely 25 with a nervous twitch in his eye, had turned and whispered something to the pastor, then taken 2 steps back and said too loudly for it to be a private rejection, "She's too old." Someone chuckled. A woman gasped. A child asked, "Is she really a bride?" And Eleanor had stood there frozen, not from shame, not from sorrow, but from the sheer shock of how swiftly dignity could be ripped from a person like a thread pulled from a hem. She didn't cry, not once. She only walked down those wooden steps with her back straight, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, and climbed into the waiting wagon without a single word. No one followed. No one called after her. The storm followed her instead. The journey westward was long, muddy, and full of silence. She sat across from a tobacco-chewing man who eyed her every time the wagon hit a bump, as if measuring whether a woman her age could still brake. The driver barely spoke except to mutter about broken axles and how a storm like this don't just pass over. Eleanor didn't speak either. She didn't tell them she had once been a wife, didn't tell them she'd buried a child, didn't explain how her brother-in-law's wife had called her a burden after the war, or how she'd sold her last possession, her mother's brooch, to pay for the ad in the paper. Mail order bride, 38 years old, strong back, quiet temper, no illusions. The ad got one reply: a widower with a boy. Can't pay much, don't need much. Just don't want to raise a child alone. She accepted. The wagon stopped for the night in a rundown station house. Thunder cracked. Eleanor sat alone by the fire staring at the flames. The man across the bench leaned in and said, "You headed for Dawson's Trail?" She nodded. "You're the bride." She nodded again. He grinned, spat into the fire. "Don't look like no bride I've ever seen." Eleanor met his eyes without blinking. "You don't look like much of a man either." He didn't speak to her again. They arrived at the edge of Dawson's Trail by dusk 2 days later. It wasn't even a town, just a long dirt path flanked by open fields. A blacksmith shed, a store, with a single window and a saloon that had more bullet holes than bottles. The wagon didn't stop. It just rolled to a creaking halt beside a corral, where 2 cows chewed fence posts. Eleanor stepped down, boots sinking in the red dirt. Her dress was stiff with dried rain. She didn't look around for a welcoming party. She already knew there wouldn't be one. But someone was watching her. A boy, no more than 6, maybe 7, wild dark hair, barefoot. He stood by the edge of fence gripping a stick and watching her like she might disappear if he blinked. She gave a small wave. He didn't return it. Footsteps behind her. A man's. She turned. He was taller than she expected, broad shoulder, but weather-worn like a barn left too long in the sun. His hat cast a shadow over eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in days. A rifle rested on one shoulder. His coat was patched, his boots uneven. He didn't speak at first, just stare at her like she was a puzzle he didn't want to solve. "You came," he finally said. "You asked," she replied. He looked past her at the driver, then back. "Thought you'd change your mind after the storm." "I didn't." He nodded once, slowly. "You're not what I expected." Eleanor tilted her chin. "Neither are you." A flicker of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one that had died a long time ago. He gestured toward a horse hitch nearby. "It's 3 miles to the ranch. I can walk." He stared at her again, then turned without a word and mounted. She followed beside him in silence. The boy trailed behind like a shadow. They passed a burned-out wagon half sunk in the mud. Buzzards circled overhead. The wind howled through the trees, sharp as a knife. No one spoke. When they finally reached the ranch, the sky was bruised purple, and the smell of rain still clung to the earth. The house was plain weather beaten and barely standing. The barn leaned left, like it had given up halfway. Eleanor stood there, taking it all in. The man dismounted, tied his reins, and said, "My name's Samuel. That's my boy Luke. His mother died last winter." She looked at the boy again. His eyes were deep wells. "I'm Eleanor," she said. Samuel nodded like it didn't matter. "There's a room in the back." Ain't much, but it's got a stove. You can keep warm. And what do you want me to do? She asked, her voice steady. Cook, keep the place from falling apart. Raise the boy best you can. I'll be in the fields. That all? His jaw clenched. I don't want a wife. I want help. Eleanor didn't flinch. Good. I stopped wanting to be a bride a long time ago. They stood there in the dusk, strangers, survivors. Then Luke did something unexpected. He walked past his father, tugged lightly on Eleanor's hand, and pointed to the barn. He didn't speak, but she followed. Inside, in a hayloft barely held together, he showed her a drawing on the wall. A woman with yellow hair, a sun overhead, a stick figure boy. Eleanor looked at it, her chest tightening. Luke stared at her, searching for something she wasn't sure she had anymore. She knelt. I'm not hers, she whispered. He didn't run. Outside, thunder rolled again, but it passed overhead. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something stir. Not hope exactly, but maybe the soil where it could grow. And the boy didn't let go of her hand. The sun cracked over the horizon like a whip, dragging golden light across the dust-choked land. The ranch looked less like a home and more like a forgotten scar. Warped fence posts, cracked troughs, and a chimney that leaned like it wanted to fall, but couldn't quite muster the effort. Eleanor stood on the front porch in silence, the morning air thick with the smell of old wood and dried manure. Somewhere behind the barn, a cow coughed like it was dying. Samuel was already outside, shirtless beneath his suspenders, muscles knotted from years of labor and grief. He chopped, like it owed him a debt, each swing of the axe deliberate and violent. The ground shook a little with every strike. Eleanor watched for a moment, then turned toward the kitchen. The stove wouldn't light. She fought with it, tried kindling, then coal, then a whispered prayer to a God she hadn't spoken to in a decade. Still nothing. Her hands blackened with soot, and her patience thinned until Samuel's voice floated in through the open door. It helps if you open a flue. She didn't look at him. It helps if someone wore me first. He came inside, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been white. Luke followed barefoot and silent, shadowing his father like a ghost with wide eyes. Samuel poured a cup of water and leaned against the wall, watching her like a man appraising a stranger in his house. You ain't afraid of hard work, he said finally. I didn't come here to rest, she answered. He nodded once. No thanks, no smile, just that same tight-lipped silence. She cooked what she could, burnt oats, half-stale bread, and coffee so bitter it could flay the tongue. Samuel ate without complaint. Luke didn't eat at all. After breakfast, Samuel vanished into the fields. Eleanor began scrubbing. She found dry blood in the barn, old but not old enough. The smell of something dead still clung to the rafters. When she opened the cellar, a rat the size of a boot lunged at her before darting into the dark. She shut the door and braced it with a chair. By noon, her arms ached. She found Luke sitting alone beneath a tree, carving something into the dirt with a stick. Mind if I sit? She asked. He didn't answer. She sat anyway. After a minute, he pointed to his drawing. Two stick figures, one taller than the other, both standing beneath the crooked sun. Eleanor swallowed hard. That me and you. He blinked, then nodded once. She felt something in her chest twist. You draw a lot. He nodded again. Well, you're good at it, she said, then stood and left before the moment broke. Too much kind as too soon had a way of unraveling children worse than cruelty. That evening, Samuel returned with blood on his hands. Not his own, just the remnants of a gone wrong. He didn't explain, just walked past her, grabbed a bottle off the shelf, and stepped onto the porch. Eleanor followed, wiping her hands on her apron. You drink a lot, she asked. He took a swig. Enough. I'd rather you didn't when the boy's awake. He didn't look at her. You'd rather a lot of things. She didn't back down. He needs more than silence and chores. Samuel lowered the bottle. You don't know what he needs. He needs someone who doesn't look at him like he's already lost. That made him turn. His eyes were steel now, sharp enough to cut. You think you're his mother now? Been here 2 days and you know everything. No, she said softly, but I know what grief smells like, and your boy is drowning in it. He stepped forward. Not a threat. Not quite. You don't get to speak on my wife. I'm not speaking on her. She replied, her voice calm but firm. I'm speaking on what's left. Silence settled like ash. A wind stirred the dust. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Finally, Samuel looked away. We had another child. a girl. Fever took her first, then her mother. Luke stopped talking that day. Hasn't said a word since. Eleanor's heart cracked, but she didn't show it. You buried them here. He nodded. Up on the hill behind the orchard. She didn't press further. That night, as the moon rose, pale and silent over the ranch, Eleanor stood in the doorway of Luke's room. He lay curled on his straw mattress, holding a small wooden carving, something old and worn smooth from fingers that needed something to hold. She didn't enter, just whispered, "Sleep easy, little one." The next morning came with gunfire. Not close, but close enough. Samuel was already saddled by the time Eleanor stepped onto porch. "Ranch north of here," he said, jaw clenched. "Coyotes are worse. Need help." He looked at her like she'd offered to grow wings. "You ever fire a rifle?" "Yes." "Good. Keep it loaded just in case." Then he was gone. The wind picked up. The animals were restless. Luke hovered near the window, eyes darting to the tree line. Eleanor moved through the house like smoke, silent, watching, waiting. Every creak in the wood felt louder than it should. Every gust outside sounded like footsteps. Hours passed. When Samuel returned, his hat was gone. Blood trickled down one arm and his eyes were wild. "What happened, poachers?" They ran. "Your arm." He waved her off. "Clean it later." She followed him to the barn. He sat on an overturned bucket, breathing hard. Eleanor brought water in a clean cloth. He didn't thank her, just grunted as she poured the water over the wound. "You're lucky," she said. "No such thing." She met his gaze. "I think you're wrong." He didn't argue. Later after dinner, as the lambs burned low and the wind died down, Samuel looked across the table and said he drew something today. A picture. Eleanor stilled. "Of what of you?" The air shifted. Something tender moved between them, thin and fragile like the first thread of a spider's web. Samuel leaned back in his chair. "I didn't want a wife," he said, voice gravel low. "And I didn't want to be anyone's second choice," she replied. Neither of them moved. Outside, the sky darkened. The storm hadn't come yet, but it would. The wind began to shift around noon, dry at first, then thick like breath against the back of your neck. The sky over the plains turned a color Eleanor had only seen once before the day her husband's regiment rode off and never returned. Pale yellow, bruised with black streaks and too quiet. She was hanging laundry when the silence snapped. The line twisted hard, the sheet ripping from the pins and sailing off like a ghost. Chickens clucked wild in the coop. Even the old mule groaned. "Storm's coming." Samuel stood at the edge of the barnyard, one hand on the fence, eyes scanning the distant horizon like it owed him an explanation. "That sky ain't right," he muttered. "Luke?" Eleanor asked, already wiping her hands on her apron. Samuel turned. Luke was gone. The boy had been there minutes ago, playing by the old stump with his knife and stick figures. Now nothing but shifting dust and scattered footprints. Samuel's expression hardened. He never wanders this far, not when it smells like thunder. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Where we go, the hills," Samuel said. "He goes there when he's scared. Same place he hid when the fever took Mary." A flash of memory struck Eleanor. Those quiet drawings, always with a hill. She sprinted toward the shed, grabbed her coat and rifle, already moving. Samuel caught up by, "I'll ride ahead," he said. "You check the tree line." "No," she snapped. "We ride together. If he's hurt, we need both of us." He stared at her, then nodded once. The storm was moving fast now, dust lifted in clouds. Trees groaned. They rode hard, wind biting at their faces. Horses uneasy beneath them. The land stretched endless, marked only by a few twisted trees and the low rise of the hills. Thunder rolled behind them like a war drum. "Luke!" Eleanor shouted into the wind. "Luke, answer me." But the wind stole her voice. A cold drop of rain hit her cheek. Then another. Then the sky tore open. The storm fell like a wall, water slamming down, thick as stone. Lightning forked across the hills, illuminating twisted shadows and jagged trees. The horses panicked, hooves sliding in the mud. Samuel barked commands barely heard over the roar. "There," Eleanor cried, pointing. A tiny figure moved just beyond a rock outcrop, staggering on a slick slope. Luke. He was clutching something, his little dog, muddy and limp in his arms. Eleanor jumped off the horse, stumbling uphill through mud and roots. Her boots sank. Her coat dragged behind her. but she reached him. "Luke," she gasped, grabbing his arm. "What were you thinking?" The boy didn't speak, just looked up with wide, terrified eyes and held out the dog. The animal's chest barely moved. Samuel reached him seconds later, panting hard. His eyes moved from Eleanor to the boy to the dog. "We need shelter." Now they scrambled under a jagged ledge, a hollow in a rock barely big enough for three. Rain pounded the earth just feet away, thunder booming overhead. The wind screamed like 100 voices. Eleanor cradled the boy in her arms, wrapping her coat around him. "We're okay," she whispered over and over. "We're okay." Samuel crouched beside her, shielding them from the worst of the wind. His hand rested on her back. She didn't shake it off. The storm raged for what felt like hours. Time lost all shape. The dog whimpered once, then went still. Luke didn't cry. He just buried his face in Eleanor's coat and held on. When the rain finally thinned and the wind broke into a whimper, they emerged. The hill was torn, roots exposed, the sky still angry. But the worst had passed. They walked back in silence, muddy, bruised, but alive. Back at the ranch, Samuel carried the dog to a small patch near the orchard and began to dig. Eleanor stayed with Luke, bathing his cuts, changing his soaked clothes. The boy never let go of her hand. Later, under a sky washed clean, they stood at the fresh grave. Samuel said nothing, just placed the dog's carved bone beside the mound. Eleanor put a hand on Luke's shoulder. "He was brave," she said softly, "and so were you." Luke looked up, then hoarse and rough, a single word escaped his lips. "Ma!" The world stopped. Samuel turned sharply. Eleanor froze. She dropped to her knees and wrapped the boy in her arms, trembling. He didn't resist. Samuel looked away. That night the storm came again, not outside, but in the quiet spaces of a house that had long forgotten warmth. Eleanor sat by the fire, drying her boots. Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee and offered her one. "First word he said in a year," he said, voice low. Eleanor nodded. "I should have gone alone," he added. "He needed both of us," she replied. "He needed someone to come for him." Samuel stared into the flames. "You were right. You know about me looking at him like he was already lost." "You weren't wrong to grieve," she said. "You were just too alone in it." They sat together for a long time. No words, just fire and silence. Then Samuel stood and walked toward the door. "He called you Ma," he said, before stepping out into the night. "That means something to you." Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't need to. The storm had come, and they were still standing. The telegram came 3 days after the storm, carried by a rider too skinny for a saddle and too nervous to look Eleanor in the eyes. He handed it over without a word, tipped his hat, and rode off like the message might explode behind him. Samuel watched him, one hand resting on a post. Eleanor stood on the porch, tearing open the envelope with hands that didn't shake, but maybe should have. For words. "He's coming for you." She read it twice, then folded it neatly, slid it into her apron, and went back to chopping vegetables. She didn't tell Samuel. Not yet. That night, she sat beside the fire. Luke curled up next to her like a pup who'd finally found a warm place to sleep. Samuel lingered in the doorway, his gaze unreadable. "You've changed him," he said. Eleanor didn't look up. "He'd changed himself. I just stayed. He calls you Ma now." She smiled faintly. "He needed someone who wouldn't leave." Samuel stepped inside, boots heavy against the floorboards. "You didn't come here to raise a boy. I didn't come here to be discarded again either. Life's funny that way." He knelt beside the fire, his face close now, closer than it had ever been. "I've been alone so long. I don't know how to be anything else. You're not alone anymore." The knock came the next morning. 3 hard raps against the door. Sharp, purposeful. Eleanor opened it and found a man dressed in black wool and fine boots, smelling of tobacco and arrogance. His eyes flicked over the house like it offended him. "Eleanor," he said, as if her name were a question. She didn't answer. He stepped forward without permission. Samuel appeared behind her in 2 strides. "You lost?" he asked flatly. "I'm here for my fiancé." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Fiancé?" The man adjusted his gloves. "We were to be married. Things got misunderstood. But I'm here now with proper intention and resources. I'd like her to return east with me." "She's not going anywhere," Samuel growled. The man ignored him, turning back to Eleanor. "I made a mistake. I admit that, but I've come to make it right." Eleanor studied him. His coat was expensive, his shoes clean. He hadn't bled, hadn't buried, hadn't worked for anything but a title and a fortune. And now he thought words could undo abandonment. "You humiliated me," she said calmly. I panicked. "You broke a vow you hadn't even made yet. I can give you a better life. Real comfort, not this dirt farm." Behind her, Luke peeked out, eyes wide. Eleanor stepped forward. "You want to fix your mistake?" "Yes," he said, hope lighting his face. "Then give that money to the orphanage outside Wichita. Tell the preacher I sent you and never come back." The man's expression darkened. "You'd rather rot out here with pigs and prairie dust, no," she said. "I'd rather stand where I'm wanted." He opened his mouth, but she had already shut the door. Samuel stared at her, quiet and still. "Thank you," she said, voice steady, but he shook his head. "You didn't need saving. You never did." That night, the fire burned brighter. Luke brought out his drawings again this time, 3 figures standing side by side beneath a sky full of stars. One of them had Eleanor's braid. Days passed. Then trouble came again, this time in the form of 3 men on horseback, guns at their sides, looking at the ranch like it was already theirs. Samuel met them at the gate. Eleanor stood on the porch, rifle across her chest. Luke hid behind the well. "You're trespassing," Samuel said, voice iron. The lead rider spit. "Land disputes. Your fence runs past the line. We're here to settle it. With bullets?" The man grinned. "Whatever it takes." They drew first. Eleanor fired without thinking. One clean shot the second man off his horse before he even aimed. Samuel tackled the third fist in fury until the man went limp in the dirt. The leader tried to flee, but Eleanor fired again, missing his shoulder by inches. He dropped his gun and raised his hands. "Go back," she said coldly, "and tell whoever sent you this land is claimed by blood if necessary." He didn't argue. It was over. Samuel stood panting, blood on his shirt, eyes wide. Eleanor lowered her rifle slowly. Luke ran to her arms, flung around her waist. "I thought," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, ever. That evening, as dusk turned the fields golden and the air cool with promise, Samuel stepped onto the porch holding something small in his hand. A necklace tarnished silver, a blue stone in the center. "It was Mary's," he said. "I've carried it for 2 years, couldn't put it down, couldn't let it go." Eleanor stared at it. He stepped closer. "But she's gone, and you're here not by chance, by choice." Her hands trembled when she took it. He reached for her other hand. Rough, strong, familiar now. "I don't have a ring," he said, voice thick, "and I don't kneel easy, but I'd like you to stay as my wife for real this time." Eleanor's throat closed. She looked toward the orchard, toward the boy drawing stars in the dirt. "Yes," she whispered 100 times, "yes." They stood together, silent, as the last light faded. They'd said she was too old to be a bride, too old to be a mother, too late for love. But some women don't bloom in spring, some bloom after fire, and they never willed again.